They called it the dragon ring, not for its cut or carrot, but for the appetite that lived behind its emerald. In torchlight it breathed like an animal, a slow green hunger that made the air near it thin and bright. On the king's breast it lay cold and bright, a circle of metal and rumour, tethered by chains of oath and blood. Those chains had kept a kingdom whole once. They had also opened doors that fed on men. By dawn the court would divide itself anew, one side wanting the ring brought down from its dais and used in full, the other willing to let it stay, cursed and contained, while they tried whatever smaller salvation the world still allowed. Between them sat a hollowing royal with skin like paper and a crown that looked too heavy to wear. King Rowan coughed old wars into the tapestries. His voice was small when it mattered. His advisers were loud and many. It was in those loud rooms the theft found its teeth. Men who spoke of honor and men who counted coin met in the same shadow. Swords were hired like tools, promises broken like bread. A handful of guards, mercenaries pressed thin by unpaid wages and fresh fear, did what the court had always done in times of collapse. They took. They moved in the grey while the king slept, while incense still folded itself toward heaven, and left with a ring wrapped in linen and the weight of a future on their shoulders. Outside the palace, a woman watched. She wore soot in the seams of her hair and a smile that had learned to be flat. Clara had learned to move like a thought no one wanted to keep. She had grown up with ash in her mouth, with bones of family pressed into her palms. The village where she had been a daughter had been a map of love, until the ring became the compass of war. She remembered the night soldiers came like wolves. Orders shouted, fire tilted toward houses, names that were not asked for repeated until silence answered. Her mother's hands had been burned clean of bread and prayer. Her brother's last breath had been a broken promise. She had sworn then to take back what had taken them. The king's ring was not merely jewelry to her. It was the instrument of the slaughter that had made her an orphan. In the years since, she had learned to be small, to slip through guards, to pick locks and pockets for more than food. Tonight, with mercenaries moving the ring through the city, she acted. Her fingers found linen, found metal. The ring did not fight in the hand that had stolen it. It waited. That waiting was a thing on which Clara could not afford to feed. She had expected a roar, a promise. Instead, there came a silence at the edges and a whisper beneath the hum of blood. For a moment she felt not power but a pressure, as if a bell had been set to toll inside her skin. Names rose in the quiet. Her mother, the burned roofs, the child who had never learned to walk, and with them a fierce elemental thought. Take it away. Make it mean something else. She did not get far. The mercenaries smelled treachery like dogs smell fear. Steel met cloth, curses met the night. In a narrow lane under snow-tarnished banners, Clara ran and stabbed where she must. Men fell hard and ugly. At one point she stopped to breathe, and the ring shone hotter, not with light but with suggestion. It suggested roads not yet walked, voices made to obey, dead friends returned to look at you with the same eyes. She blinked. She could not let the thought live, not yet. The chase uncorked a dozen small truths. The palace was not as loyal as its tapestries claimed. The crown could be made to tremble. By dawn, the ring had vanished into the north, into country, where people still answered to older names and older debts. If you love dark fantasy lore and cliffhanger legends, subscribe for more. They called him Mortos in the villages that feared him, and by names that older men used like charms. He was not a Moor of leather and thunder. He was a man who had learned economy of movement and of cruelty. He had reasons for his ambition that smelled of cold logic and a courtly contempt for soft, useless mercy. Where the king had let rot fester into policy, Mortos saw order to be taken and remade. He argued quietly that the dead were not dead enough, that the crown's misused power could be righted if only it was retooled. The ring, for him, was a tool and a provocation. Mortos lived in ruins, in rooms where the light tasted like old prayers. He did not wear the grotesque armor of villain song. His eyes were precise, his hands memorized the anatomy of grief. He moved through corpses as a man might move through furniture, practical, efficient. He raised a boy in a ruined chapel once, a child knotted to the earth by a mother's mourning. With black thread and intent, he tied the child's name to the world again. The body sat up as wood might hold a nail. It did not smile. It reached for a mother who had gone to dust. That reach was hollow. The touch that followed left neither warmth nor peace. Mortos watched the eyes blink and catalogued the cost. "This is not mercy," the old priest said, voice tight as twine. He would not call him a monster, and Mortos would have been annoyed. He preferred clarity. "It is better than the crown's forgetfulness," Mortos replied. He did not ask for forgiveness. He asked for consequence. "They leave ghosts at their borders and call it sovereignty. I simply teach them to answer. There is a ladder of hunger to which men can climb when given a reason." Mortos climbed with patient hands. He spoke to annihilated men in villages and in the bones of cities, where mothers torched their own homes to say no to the crown. He offered something like purpose, return with commands attached. He did not promise true resurrection. He promised power. The dead he raised did not reclaim a life. They borrowed one, wearing it like a shirt with seams frayed. They obeyed, and that obedience made Mortos's idea grow. Meanwhile the north watched. The tribes had names the maps forgot to spell correctly: Black Drift, Wolfmother, Five Fingers, Hearth-End, and Stonehand. 1,000 small customs stitched them together as much as separated them. They mistrusted kings and crowns because crowns had often turned their mountain needs into city wars. They had their own rituals, their own ghosts. Since infancy, the northern clans kept a lesson. You do not trade your bones for a king's promise. But when Clara came to them with the ring, wrapped and swear-worded and small in her palm, things shifted. She did not come as a queen in exile. She came with a smell of smoke and a story that would not suffer silence. She told them in the way of thieves, shortly and with eyes on the knife between her ribs. The elders considered her the way a bone might be turned in the fire, to see if it was marrow or stone. "Why would we let a southern curse into our hearth?" asked Edda of Stonehand, the woman with scars across her knuckles, and a voice used to being obeyed by men younger than her grandchildren. She spat once. Clara told them about the burning, about how the ring had been used as argument and ordinance, and how the king's men had called it justice. "A crown that kills its own feeders is not a crown," Clara said. "The ring made them sharp. It made them cruel. I did not take it to make kings serve me. I took it to keep it from deciding which of us will die to make a kingdom whole." They argued in the blunt, endless way of people who must decide without help. The ring shimmered under cloth on a table in a communal tent, and the men who'd spent their lives on the brink of being slaughtered leaned into it as if it might be a small son. The tribe's prophets, old women who still told the world the shape of what the elders feared, whispered about binding and blood. "The ring answers with price," Hala murmured, fingers like twigs. "It eats a thing for what it gives. It takes names." There, under canvas and under a north sky that was glaucous with worry, the forbidden ritual was pronounced aloud for the first time in this story. Not as a charm, not as a child's dare, but as a thing in the mouths that must decide heavy cases. A rite older than the king's coin, a binding practiced in times when a single line could not hold an entire valley. The ritual gathered tribes not by treaty but by marrow. It required a ring, blood offered to a circle sketched in earth, and an oath that would bind one soul to the ring to tether the rest together. It was forbidden because of what it demanded, because binding a soul to power had the old taboo stamped on it. The North had not used it in a decade, in two, certainly not since the time when a chieftain's child had been walled into a jewel and war had followed. These things live long in memory. They argued over its necessity. Clara argued too. Her voice grew older that night. Anger had taught it to be cold. "If we do not bind, we will scatter like embers," she told them. "Mortos takes the land in pieces. The crown falters. By the time they decide what sort of rule they want, we will have no ground left to fight over." Edda shook her head. "And what then, Clara? Do we trade one oath for another? Do we trade the chance to bury our dead for a promise of revenge?" "Revenge is a poor master," said Laris, a young man from Hearth End, who joined Clara after she'd saved his sister from a patrol. "But survival is a better teacher than grief." They tried counsel. They weighed advantage against soul price. In the end, they did not decide. Not that night. The ring had its own manners. It did not speak with words. It offered images that were not lies, and the allure of each image was for the person who held it. To a grieving man, it might show a child's face made warm again. To a soldier, it might reveal banners waving without blood. To a traitor, it might show oblivion. To Clara, it flashed moments that could be shaped into one outcome. Vengeance laid like a straight track before her feet. She kept the ring wrapped and slept with it under her cloak. Sometimes in the midnight halves, she put it to her mouth and felt nothing but cold metal. Other nights it suggested a warmth, and a dead brother leaning close, whispering strategies. Such temptations have stages. For some men they are small, and the changes are simply in the way they swear. For others, the difference is that their hands no longer fear things that should be feared. At the trading post between Stonehand and Wolfmother, a chieftain's nephew left with silver and with a promise that he'd be back to take a river. When he touched the ring, he woke with a hunger that tasted like maps and crowns. In the morning, the nephew led a raid of his own, just to see if power had teeth. Clara's path braided with Brent's by accident, and then by choice. Brent still carried the trappings of a palace man, clean hands, a manner that refused to let itself rust. Once he had been called a prince on the right days. Thereafter he had been an officer of the guard, sworn to a crown whose policies felt like rust under his nails. He had left the palace with more questions than authority. When they met, he had been running from his own ghosts, a memory of a man he admired and lost to the ring's decisions, a promise to a sister he could not uphold. They saved each other in the cold. Brent was unsure of Clara. She smelled of smoke and was unfit for parlour conversation, but he fought beside her, and when he saw what the ring could do, he learned to be careful. He also understood, with the peculiar cruelty of men who have had good things and been taught to call them sins, that the ring might be the only thing capable of stopping Mortos. That thought frightened him more than the dead. "She should have given it to the crown," a mercenary once said when he saw the ring swathed in Clara's pack, as if to say that order was worth its price. He did not know the cost. He did not know the tally written into Clara's bones. "That crown is rotten," Brent answered. He had lived inside the palace long enough to count the rot's pattern. "They will use it to justify the things we already hate. It will make them saints who burn us in winter." He kept to the practical view. "We need allies. Mortos has followers now, more every day. The people he brings back are a different kind of soldier. They will not quit." "Then we unite them," Clara said, "or we die trying." There came a fight in which the ring's will showed itself like thunder. They tried to move through a mountain pass that smelled of iron and old snow, carrying the ring. Mortos had learned that the ring was travelling north. He sent agents who smelled of cold wisdom and a deliberate cruelty. They ambushed them in a crease of stone and wind. The initial clash was brutal and quick and honest. Men met each other with the same intentions as knives. During that scuffle, a young soldier from the Wolfmother tribe took the ring for a second between skinned fingers. He had lost a brother to a raid months before and had not learned to sleep without thinking of his eyes. The ring warmed in his palm like a hearth. It offered him an image, his brother at the edge of the fire, whole and laughing. He saw clearly how to make that image happen. He believed for a single breath that it was a law of the world. Make the dead stand again, and they will thank you for it. He brought the ring up to his lips and uttered a vow. For a heartbeat the air went right with order. Then, like frost thawing, the thing it threw back was wrong. The brother who rose was not the brother who'd loved him. He was a hollow likeness with eyes like coins. The soldiers rejoicing turned to a sound that belonged to a living man, betrayed by his own hands. That soldier laid down his head and did not weep openly. The rest of them watched the folly of a hope that cost true life and saw what the ring demanded. None wanted to accuse the ring at first, they accused the man instead. He had failed to be careful. News of that partial resurrection reached Mortos with a surgeon's grin. He took apart its mechanics and stitched them into his own plan. If a soul could be borrowed, could a soul be bound? If binding was possible, could the prophecy that kept the ring near the royal blood be worked around? The law, as written, said the ring could not leave the royal line until the last descendant died. Mortos did not argue with that law. He planned to turn it into an arithmetic problem. If souls could be moved, if the ring could be made a receptacle, the law could be delayed or obstructed. He preferred to call it a loophole for history. Ulrich was a problem in all of this. Once a commander of Rowan's guard, he had been a man with a stern jaw and loyalty like a shield. After the ring's darker uses became evident, he had been sent to secure the ring at times and had failed more than once. One mission left him grievously wounded. When he returned, his gait was wrong, and his face carried a greyness that made men look away when they spoke to him. Some said he had been touched by the ring at the place where the world meets sorrow. Others said Mortos had reached him with promises and a bottle of bitter truths. Whatever the cause, Ulrich drifted near power without owning it, a shadow of authority that made those under him uncertain whether to follow or to flee. Clara did not trust Ulrich. She had known men who kept oaths until the way for them broke, and Ulrich's broken walk made him difficult to understand. He hunted the ring with a zeal that bordered on worship. But worship at its edge is often indistinguishable from fear. In the market outside Stonehand, she watched him from a stall roof as he spoke to men who would move like wolves. He listened, nodded, and left with the sort of smile that had once belonged to a man who could kill without curiosity. "He's not the old Ulrich," Brent said later, when they burned some stew and shared bread that tasted like little else but possible survival. "He walks like a man who owes himself favors." "Then he will collect," Clara answered. She folded her hands around the ring beneath her cloak and felt how it trembled with small promises. "Or he will be taken." Mortos's shadow spread. He turned a village road into a procession of the returned. He filled the outskirts with men who had smiles but did not sleep. He paraded a resurrected captain through a ruined lane so that those who watched would know his capability. For those who had lost everything, the sight of dead things moving with purpose was both hope and contagious terror. Mortos did not provide absolutes, but he taught men that the dead could be pointed and that order needed only a hand to direct it. When a messenger brought word that the palace's guard would not or could not pursue further into the north, the tribes understood the arithmetic. The crown had consumed itself. Mortos had method. The ring could be either a hammer or a prison. In the tents and in the halls, they built a possible plan. The forbidden ritual, old enough to be remembered only in songs, resurfaced in the mouths it had once cursed. It was the kind of idea that bled over the edge of taboo when the only alternative was surrender. Clara stood before the elders and the young fighters and did not speak like a thief. She spoke with a mind that had seen the cost of being unsworn to the world. "We do not have to bind a soul to this ring for the sake of conquest," she told them. "We can bind one to keep us living. We can tie the ring as a lock so that it cannot be used as freely. We can make it a centerpiece of a defense that will buy us time. If we use it as a lock." "You would take a life to buy time?" Hala asked. Her voice had the shape of a grave. A life that is chosen, Clara said. She did not say whose. She had thought of that question all the way up from the south. There is a narrowness in the heart of people who will sacrifice for many. They say their sacrifices are noble until they are asked to name who yields. The northern tribes did not finally agree. Some wanted the ritual as a sword, others as a chain. The elders argued the old way. In stories where the binding had been used for honor, the cost had been tall and clear. In ones where it had been used for war, it had festered into hunger. They debated until the moon was thin as a coin. While they debated, Mortos moved. He sent scouts like fingers made of frost. He resurrected a midwife in the edges of a forest and taught her to carry secrets back to him. He had patience like steel. He also had a rule: never waste a petition that could be reshaped into a demand. When some in his following began to speak of sacred return, of the dead as rightful servants, he answered with the blunt thought of a man who believed order could be enforced and history could be restitched. Clara kept the ring close, and as the winter moved in, she learned small things about leadership she had only at first mimed. Leadership did not look like banners. It looked like steady decisions about misery. It looked like choosing which field to burn for warmth and which to leave to a man whose wife might not survive it. It looked like listening to an old woman sing a dirge and then deciding you would risk your life to keep her from being taken by a passing patrol. It looked like receiving a child who had no place and deciding to make a small refuge with nothing more than a blanket and a promise. At one point, late, and with the fog like a sheet between tents, Clara had the ring out. She turned it and watched the green inside ripple as if under a wind. She thought of taking it to the ceremony and binding it to the circle to hold them together. She thought of the oath it would demand. She thought in the black of rubbing the ring against the skin of someone she loved and of the price stamped into it. She put the ring down and walked away. It is one thing to say you will not use what you have, and another to refuse it when the dead are gathering in ranks and the forests are full of men with the smell of Mortos in their mouths. The choice of binding was not a single point. It spread like frost through decision-makers. For some it was imperative, for others a thief's reckoning. A raid came then, small and ugly. Reanimated men, thin in the body but steady in gait, cut through a village in the night. They took livestock. They pushed people into cold beams of wooden pens. Clara and Brent reached the clearing as they could and fought. The dead were efficient. They wanted to take, not to kill where it complicated plans. Clara killed one of them with a thrown blade and watched as it fell and did not stay down. Its head tilted like a doll and then faced her. For a moment she saw a face she might have loved. Someone from a life that could have existed and had to fight the urge to call it by its old name. That is a small cruelty the living must sometimes master, the recognition of wrong things. When the dust settled, a man rose from among the taken. He was not whole. He smoked a little at the edges like a candle. He had been a chieftain's cousin, a man who had laughed at children. The tribe's healer touched him and felt the unnatural coolness where a heart should have been hot. She called it blasphemy. Mortos called it a step. The argument that followed was not poetic. "If we do nothing," said Edda, "those things will march and claim bone and soil until we are last, and then they will claim what is under the stones." "Then bind the ring," a young voice said. "Bind it to a soul who knows the price." "Who decides?" Hala asked. "Who steps into the jewel, knowing their name will be bound?" The silence that followed tasted of iron. Brent, who had seen palaces crumble under the weight of such choices, said, "We cannot pick a martyr. We can pick someone who chooses. The ritual must be voluntary." Clara thought of the choices she had not been given in her life. She had been given one now, the ring in her hand and the north in her debt. She could use the ritual as a chain or as a sword. She could bind a life and make them die beautiful in history, or she could refuse and see Mortos carve their names into memory without consent. The decision moved forward not as a single voice, but as a rumor, and then as a plan. They would prepare. The elders would consult the old ones who still remember the ritual steps. They would make the circle. They would speak the names they must. They would teach the drums to speak and the fires to call ancestors. They would practice the language of binding. At the edge of camp, a messenger arrived with a note written on the bark of a tree and tied with hair. Ulric's mark was on it. He was approaching with men. The line between fear and strategy thinned. Mortos marched in the same news, like two tides approaching the same shore. Clara felt the ring like a living weight. It thrummed with possible futures she did not want to acknowledge. She did not betray the moment with speech. She took the ring, wrapped it, and walked toward the place they would make their circle. The earth there was old and lined with bones. The night air smelled of iron and the smoke of torches. The drums were being tested. When she reached the place, she found more than she had bargained for. A shape moved in the dark among the elders, a man with a limp and a face that had forgotten to be gentle. Ulric stood at the edge of the drums and smiled with the kind of smallness that breaks pacts. He did not come alone. Behind him were men whose eyes had the dull gleam that returns to those who have been near Mortos' work. "You should not have come," Edda said to Ulric when she recognized him. Her hand rested on a spear in the way elders practice, like remembering something for later. "I came to see reason," he said. His voice was lower than it had been. "To speak of the crown's need and the way of law. Give me the ring, and we can avoid bloodshed." Clara felt something inside her tilt like a stone in water. She wanted for a moment to hand it to him and watch the old order stitch itself back together. She wanted to believe in law. She felt the ring advise an easier path. Let it return to the south, and they would be spared a trial. But the memory of smoke and a child's last breath stopped that lie. "No," she said, simple as a blade. "We keep it here." Ulric's eyes flashed then, not with anger but with an old soldier's nervous humor. "You make enemies of kings and of necromancers, girl. That is an odd way to be remembered." "Better an odd memory than no memory at all," Clara answered. The argument widened. Men took sides. Torches burned higher. The drums grew in their cadence until the earth itself sounded like a heart. Outside the tent line, someone shouted the distant sound of boots, Mortos's men moving through the trees, and a second voice called like a bell, a herald from the south bearing the king's seal. The choice that had been patient for months collapsed like brittle ice. They would prepare the ritual. They would attempt to bind the ring to one life, and so make it a lock rather than a weapon. The elders moved to mark the circle. The young men practiced the oaths. The seer Halla laid hands on the ring and felt the appetite in it like a living thing. She did not smile. "To bind is to pay," she said. "Remember that. Do not be swept in the song of success and forget the debt." Clara thought of the boy whose hand had touched the ring and whose brother had come back wrong. She thought of Mortos's patient hands and of the king coughing like a man who has swallowed his country. She thought of a life to be chosen, and whether anyone could choose that far. As the moon rose and the drums called, a shadow moved at the tree line. It was not quite solid. It was a man wrapped in darkness and a smile. Mortos had come with men, silent and patient. His army of the returned spread like a slow net. The night air sharpened. The ring pulsed under Clara's hand. It was almost a furnace now, or a wound. It promised what the world might want most and what it least deserved. She could feel the choice settling like frost across her shoulders, to bind or to let the world tear itself apart. She stepped toward the circle, feeling the weight of all the arguments like stones in her pockets. The drumbeat rose, and the tribes called their names into the cold. Ulric watched, his face all shades of negotiation. Mortos's men waited like hands in a shadow. The forbidden ritual was no longer a rumor to be whispered. It was a motion about to be made, with all the danger and some small hope tangled in it. Then, just before the first oath was to be spoken aloud, a shout broke the night from the hill. Someone had fired an arrow into a tent where an elder slept. The sound of fleeing feet cracked the calm like thin glass. The world swung, and with it every plan caught on the edge of a knife. The arrow that struck the elder's tent was not meant to scatter sleep so much as to snap a spine. Canvas tore like a throat. An older voice, Haller's, harsh and quick, shouted a name that sounded like a curse. Torches flared. Men and women tumbled from sleeping rolls, hands finding weapons with the practiced speed of wolves roused. Somewhere beyond the drums, a child began to cry, and then was quiet, the sound swallowed by night. Clara felt the ring in her fist, as if it were a pulse at her fingertips. It hummed now with the same exacting tone it had used to hum through dreams, images rearranged like cards. She could see, for an instant, the elder struck. The tent gasped open, the ritual broken before the first oath. She pushed the vision away and moved. The camp exploded into movement, scouts racing to the trees, elders pulled by men whose faces were taut with urgency, a shadow shape of Ulrich stepping from the dark, as if to take advantage of splintered law. In the chaos, Mortos's scouts slid like dark water through the trunks, bearing news back to a figure who watched strategy as if reading a book. Mortos stood a short distance off under a dead birch, a cloak that took light and made it heavier. Up close, he was not an old crone or a demon, but a man with cold hands and the patience of one who rewired cities. He watched the camp shift, and smiled the way someone smiles to themselves when they have just tipped a balance in their favor. "They are quick to anger," he said to the nearest of his reanimated followers, a man who had once been a smith and now moved with the efficiency of an instrument. "Good. Anger makes mistakes." The smith looked at him with eyes that did not see Mortos as a man, but as a command. In the smith's chest, a place that used to be heat had been replaced by a mechanism that accepted instruction. Mortos's voice was a caliper. It measured grief and found it wanting. For him, the ritual was a problem to be solved, political algebra. If the North bound itself to the ring, he reasoned, they might join the crown out of dread or might break themselves in the attempt. If the ring was locked by a binding ritual, Mortos could still win by making the ring a vessel and then moving souls into it as parts of an equation. If a royal blood were put into it, the equation might change. If not, he could create loopholes. He liked the smell of solutions. Back in the circle field, torches burned bright enough to make sweat stand on foreheads. Elder Edda paced the inner ring like a watchful dog, spear in hand. Haller, whose voice had snapped the first alarm, crouched over a bundle and spat for luck. The drum cadence had been broken but not ended. Men who had practiced for months to keep rhythm struggled now to remember the measure. "Who fired?" Edda demanded. Her question was a blade. "No time to identify," Brent answered. He had a spear in one hand and a bandage at his side. He had spent the last hours moving like a man who still carried a palace in his back pocket, always prepared for etiquette, always ready to unmake a lie. Now that the lie had been made plain, he moved with the urgency of one who had been given a different kind of promise, one to defend what remained of a people. Ulrich stepped forward then, his limp conspicuous in the torchlight. He did not ask for permission. He had come as if he had expected to find disorder and then impose order on it. His face, up close, was a palimpsest of service, the lines of command, the greyness of nights he could not remember, the look of a man whose conscience had been remodeled. He held himself like an old blade, tempered beyond its maker's intention. "You let them break your circle," Ulrich said, low enough that only those near could hear. "You call drums and elders and then let a stray arrow find a mouth." Edda snorted. "We fought to keep the city from bringing its ways north, Commander." So fight like you did when you had discipline, Ulrich answered, or hand me that ring and let me bring the law that will stop Mortos before he learns to count the dead. You brought no law, Clara said, her voice carried. She did not move toward him. She kept the ring close under her cloak, as if the metal could sense betrayal and go cold against her skin. You brought a hand that had been bought by fear. The words hit Ulrich like wind through mail. For a moment his jaw tightened. Something like pain passed across his face. He would have answered with a soldier's rebuke, but a fresh shout from the tree line cut him off. Mortos's men were moving into the clearing, silent as regret. The battle began then, without the formality of a declaration. Mortos's reanimated formed a line like a pale hedge. Their approach made the ground tilt with a wrongness. The dead do not breathe the same. They do not smell of the sun. They moved with a rigidity that allowed for no hesitation. The northern warriors met them like a sea-wall. Spears rose, flint flashed. Men shouted names that meant something in the small language of survival. Clara pushed through the throng. She felt the ring buzz as if it were a living being irritated by heat. It wanted to be set down in a place where its potential would be measured and claimed. In the melee she recognized faces, some half-remembered, some new. A dead chieftain's cousin charged with the edge of grief on his face and struck at a corpse that might once have been a neighbor. The body rolled and then stood again, and the man who hit it stared, as if struck himself. Brent fought at Clara's side. He had kept his hand from taking the ring in public. That was a promise he kept like another oath. He moved with the measured fury of someone who loved and therefore feared the object at the heart of the war. When a reanimated archer loosed an arrow that would have caught a child at the edge of the camp, Brent leapt and took it. Blood spread across his tunic like a map being rewritten. They pushed Mortos's line back with the kind of brutality born of necessity, quick feints and cruel resolves. Ulrich took advantage, commanding contingents and shifting lines. At one point he cut down a reanimated officer with a strike that was a textbook of killing. But even as they drove the dead back, Clara could feel the ring pulsing under her cloak, offering again that old, terrible ledger. Who might be brought back and what that would cost. Each time someone fell and then rose again with blank eyes, the ring suggested a solution. Each time the suggestion flared and then left ashes in the throat of the listener. Mortos watched and measured the responses as if reading a market. He let the initial wave break and saw who had the mettle to stand. He had not come to simply take the ring in a sword strike. He had come to prove to the North that the crown's impotence could be circumvented. He wanted to show that the dead could be enlisted and that the ring was a hinge, not a miracle. If he could drive enough terror into the North, his ideology would appear attractive, order, even with stolen warmth. Then came the thing no plan had fully predicted. As the clash reached its height, someone, Marisa, a warrior whose presence Clara had known but whose name had been saved for a time like a coin, rushed at Ulrich with the single-minded violence of loss. She had always been the kind of fighter who did not welcome second chances. Her blade found Ulrich's side, cutting through scar and mail. Ulrich staggered, shock painting his features. For a heartbeat he looked like a man unmasked. No pity, no calculation, just the flaring human who had been struck. He fell into the mud with a sound like a life losing a sentence. Those near him hesitated. A commander down is a change of governance. The ring itself might tremble at such a sight. Ulrich's eyes found Clara in that moment, and for a thin instant something like regret passed over him. He tried to speak, to give the order that would restore him, but the sound was weak and then gone. Blood pooled. He was not dead by the old code. He was merely mortal in a world that had been practicing different trades. Marisa stood over him, breathless, face awash with the light of deeds done. He would have sold us to law, she said, not to Clara alone, but to the circle that had gathered. Her voice had no triumph in it. It carried the weight of a woman who'd been forced to remove a rotten tooth. Ulric's hand twitched toward the ring in Clara's cloak, as if in the act of accusation. But before he could reach, Mortos's men pressed in, and Ulrich, wounded, was taken and dragged toward a line of the returned. For a beat, Clara thought Ulrich might be raised by Mortos, brought back as a thing to take command in Mortos's stead. That would have been a cruelty both practical and symbolic. The crown's own commander remade into a puppet for the necromancer. The thought made her stomach hollow. Brent, bleeding but steady, looked at Clara then. There was a look shared between them, heavy with everything they had seen and done. "We can't let him take the ring," he said. "If Mortos binds it, he doesn't need law to hold power. He only needs enough dead to make the living bend." Clara recognized the truth in his voice. Mortos's plan had been subtle, make the ring usable as both leash and engine. If Mortos could make the ring into a receptacle and then pour demands into it, he could hold the North by the neck with laws made of bone. They pushed back. The North's drums found a stammering rhythm again, and the reanimated fell in numbers sufficient to make the field a wrong sort of victory. Mortos' men retreated into the woods, with sound like the scraped throat of a departing animal. The immediate danger abated, but the cost was visible. Blood in the earth, a commander fallen, the ring's hunger waking in Clara's blood. They tended to the wounded. Ulrich lay on his back with a face gone white and thin. Halla pressed her hands to his chest and found only the small, irregular thing that still beat. He would not die quickly now, nor live easily. Somewhere in the trees, Mortos's voice threaded through the leaves, quiet and patient. He had not been repelled. He had been tested. Night thinned. The elders returned to the council, and the question returned with new, sharpened edges. Who would bind? The discussion, which had once been theoretical, now carried the smell of fresh blood. The tribe's stories of past bindings were told again, but this time the listeners were not merely curious. They were tired and raw, the kind of people to whom stories were bargaining chips. "If we bind it as a lock," Edda said, "we must choose a life to put into it. Voluntary or not, there is a cost." "We choose a volunteer," Halla said firm. "No chain that forces a soul. That is still a choice, even if the outcome is sorrow." Brent listened quietly. In the flicker of the tent light, his face was bruised by a decision he had been turning like a stone in his palm. He had watched how the ring tempted men with their losses, and saw what happened when grief became law. He understood more than most that binding the ring to a life could make it less a sword and more a jail. If the soul chosen was willing, and if the ritual was precise enough to make the ring refuse other manipulations. There was a silence. Voices dipped and rose, then fell away. In the corner of the tent a voice, small and clear, offered itself. "I will do it," said a woman no one had considered earlier in the night, a quiet voice full of iron. It was T, a healer who had bandaged both wounds and souls in ways that left her calloused. Her hands had made warm things out of broken bodies for seasons. Her voice had the steady cadence of someone who had spoken with death and made pacts. "No," Brent said immediately. "This isn't for—" T looked at him. "You think I haven't seen the dead? You think I do not know what it means to keep a child from the cold for one more breath? But that does not mean I will surrender the memory of what we are to some ring." She touched her own chest lightly, an old scar there, a sign of losses paid. "If binding is to be a lock, it must be a lock chosen by one who understands what will be lost." "T," Halla began. T raised a hand. "No more speeches. I volunteer. I will be the soul. If the ritual makes a lock of me, then let it be known that I chose." At that, murmurs rose like small waves. Some elders cursed softly, others nodded like men who had been waiting to see the shape of courage. Then Brent reached for her hand and took it as if to stead her and not to stop her. He had not expected her to volunteer, and his throat closed around the word he had prepared. "No, Brent said this time, and it wasn't an answer to T. His voice wavered, but the decision behind it was certain. No, I will. The tent went very quiet. Everyone turned to him as if he had just thrown a stone into a pond, and the ripples were yet to be measured. You will not, Haller said sharply. You are a prince, Brent finished for her. He let the word fall. He had not been one to offer the title often, but the responsibility folded in like a map. Yes, I am, in a sense. It is blood I cannot deny. It is a line that the ring remembers. If binding a life to the ring will keep Mortos from making the ring whatever tool he wants, then I will be the one. I will choose for myself what my blood owes. They spoke in bursts and in pleas. T's lips trembled, and she put a hand to Brent's cheek in a gesture not of rebuke, but of recognition. You think you can fix a thing with your name? She asked. You think your blood can be a remedy? I know what it will cost, Brent replied, and I am old enough to weigh it. I will not let some other child be bound in ignorance or in poverty. If it must be bound to a royal thread, let that risk be mine. Clara felt the world tilt at his words. All that grief, her own and all others, compacted into something that was not simply sacrifice, but a law made of flesh. She understood then that Brent had made a decision that would become a story. A prince who stepped into a duel to stop a necromancer. The choice was beautiful and tragic at once. T's fingers found his hand then, squeezing. She looked at him with a softness that said more than the words the elders shouted. Then we must do this rightly, she said. No tricks, no half-binding. You choose and we bind. The ritual preparations began anew, this time with an urgency that made the drumbeat a thing closer to a heartbeat. They cleaned the circle, mixed oils, cut their palms to let the blood run in the designated grooves. The steps were archaic and precise, names spoken to call ancestors, the ring placed in the center as if to tempt it into being a promise, and finally the voice of the volunteer, for they had decided Brent's choice was the truest kind of volunteer, to state consent. Clara stood at the edge of the ring, her hand resting on little more than distance. The wind had fallen, and the night itself seemed like a thing listening. Mortos's shadow moved at the tree line like smoke, and for a moment Clara caught the glint of movement. He had not come alone. He was near enough that the night tasted of conspiracy. When the time came, Brent stepped into the circle. He carried the ring on a small cushion, not wrapped in cloth, but displayed as if to confirm its import. The ring's emerald blinked in the torchlight and seemed to drink it. For a heartbeat, every eye in the circle fell upon Brent, the young man with palace manners and battle-corroded guilt. He looked small in the ring's green light, like a candle in a hurricane. "Speak your name," Haller intoned. The seer's voice was old and steady, the sort of voice that makes oaths feel like rock. "Brent of the old line," he said. "Brent Greenwood. I speak my name in blood and in will. I give my heart's claim to this ring. I choose to bind my soul into it, to hold it from those who would break the world with it." Around him, others took the oaths as their parts demanded, to keep the ring guarded, to call for help if it began to hunger for what it had not been given, to remember Brent as both sacrifice and sentinel. The elders' chants rose into the air like a net thrown up against the stars. The names they called were old ones, ancestors who had once taken lesser sacrifices and whose ghosts might yet understand what it meant to be a hinge. Brent knelt then. He extended a palm and pressed his bleeding hand against the ring at the center. The green light ran up his arm like smoke. The air grew cold. For a moment, Clara heard in her head the echo of every wound she had known and the sound of a brother's laugh that she had let die. Brent's face was pale but not frightened. There was a kind of concentration on it that made her think of men who read maps by blood. The ring answered. It glowed deeper, emerald turning to forest, to moss, to the eyes of something that watched for hunger. It tugged like a tide at Brent's soul, as if to pull it into glass. The elders chanted faster. The drums rolled into a thunder that made the earth hum. The sky, insofar as there was a sky above that heavy air, seemed attentive. Then from the edges of the circle came a sound like a steel file on bone. Mortos's voice, smooth and filled with an odd pride. "You make noble bargains," he called, "but bargains do not stop need. If you trap a man's soul in a jewel, you have made a lantern of mercy. I will make a lantern of force. We shall see whose light is longer." Clara looked past the ring at Mortos. He had stepped forward from the trees, his cloak catching in the torchlight like a dark flag. Behind him the returned lined up in menacing ranks. He did not raise a blade. He had no need. The ritual was the theatre he preferred. He had arrived to teach a lesson about how such things could be twisted. "You want to take what we choose to give," Clara said low. "You want to force our grief into your laws." Mortos smiled then, and the smile was less a mouth than a theorem. "I want a world where the dead answer and the living do not hide behind their cowardice. I want order. Your choice is not wrong if it leads to order." Brent's voice cut through. "Order forged by bartered souls is not order. It is a debt with no ledger." Mortos' face darkened, as if Brent's words had shown him a flaw he could not take apart. He stepped closer to the ring, and for a heartbeat the green light shivered, as if the jewel had been touched by too many fingers. "You will see," Mortos said softly. "Bind your prince to your jewel, and you will teach a lesson. Blood can pay for peace. But the earth will remember also. I will show you what becomes of a jewel full of kings' breaths." He raised a hand then, and the returned stepped forward as if at a cue. The line pressed closer. For a moment it looked as if Mortos might break the ritual with a strike. Men tensed. Hala's voice rose higher in the old language, the syllables throwing themselves into the night like sparks. The ring responded to Brent's oath in a way none of them had been able to fully script. Brent's eyes closed, and then opened to something farther away. A pressure pushed at his chest, as if some weight was being placed upon him. He gasped and smiled, and Clara could not tell whether the smile was from relief or from already being gone. "Do you see?" Mortos asked the crescent of men who had gathered. "This is the cornerstone of a different polity. A man will step into a jewel, and the jewel will hold him. Then who is to say the jewel cannot hold others and be offered a bargain of the kind it desires?" Hala answered him without opening her mouth to words. She raised a palm, and a flint flashed, and for a heartbeat the ring's light seemed to wobble. The drums beat faster. The elders recited the final syllables. The binding took as if an old stitch had been retied. Brent sagged forward then, his body folding into itself like a book closing. He did not cry out. Instead he lay there, his face turned to the stars, and a thin green wash of light seeped up through his palm and into the ring. For those nearest, a sound came, an inhale that was not a simple breath but something larger. The green pooled inside the jewel and then stilled. The ring sat dark as glass, but it had a new weight in it. For the north, the ritual had been completed. A cheer rose, half victory and half mourning. The elders leaned on one another. Somehow, in that moment, the ring felt less like a promise of violence and more like an anchor. Mortos did not move. He stood and watched, containing the urge to strike into something like calculation. The returned shuffled back into the dark wood. The immediate danger had been tempered, but the cost would not be clean. Brent's skin had gone strangely pale, and his breath came in shallow, even pulls. T knelt beside him, hands trembling as she touched his chest. She felt a pulse that had a foreign cadence, as if a part of him had already been folded into metal. Brent's eyes opened then, and Clara saw not only a prince and a fighter, but a man wearing a knowledge that his name would now be told differently. "You did not have to," she said to him, though he could not be sure that his hearing was fully his anymore. She felt the truth of regret and the hush of a gratitude too heavy to voice. He gave a small half-smile. "I did," he whispered. "The North needed a choice that didn't hurt the poor. This is a poor thing, perhaps, but if the ring is held by a name, it remembers, my name, then maybe there is a tether it cannot break." They did not have time to dwell on heroics. Even as Brent lay breathing in a way that made the elders fidget, Mortos stepped closer and placed a hand, ghostly, on the ring's setting. For a moment, Clara felt the metal under the cushion hum in a way it had not before. The ring drank the touch and then threw back an image, not Brent's face, but a palace, empty rooms, the slow drying of banners. The image suggested possibilities that made the breath catch in Clara's throat. "Not so fast," Mortos said. "You think by putting a prince's name inside you have solved the law? The ring belongs to a line, yes, but it belongs to need more. If I cannot take it from you, I will make a way to use what you have asked twist upon you." Mortos did not have to explain the mechanics of his plan. The elders had already seen the half-resurrections and how those had been misused as tools. He could bind souls into a jewel and use them as levers. Brent's sacrifice might lock the ring, yet Mortos could still attempt to shove demands into it, pervert it into something else. The difference, Mortos hinted, was only one of tempo and cruelty. The North had one last weapon, ceremony. Hala, sensing the shift in Mortos's design, raised her voice in a tone so old that it felt like wind on bone. The words she spoke were not meant to intimidate Mortos, but to build a wall, spells of exclusion, of anchoring, of law. The elders joined in, and for a time the ring sat quiet under the edge of their chant. Mortos listened, and then laughed softly, a sound like a man locking a door in a house with no windows. "You bind with old words," he said. "I bind with consequence." Without further fanfare, he did what he did best. He pushed forward a plan that was less a seizure and more a patient maneuver. From the grove he produced small sachets and bones and things woven into a kind of necromantic ledger. He raised them to the ring and began to chant in a language that was not the North's. The returned drew closer, their movements precise and patient. The elders' chants and Mortos's invocations grappled with each other in the air, two different magics attempting to make the same piece of metal say a different thing. The field around the ring felt like a wound. One side pulled with a stitch that was ancient and legal, the other scraped it with a tool that cleaned and then took. The tension built until the ring flared, bright as if a lantern had been struck from within. Then Brent, in a way that made everyone near him recoil, reached a hand up. The ring seemed to respond to his will, as if it had been waiting for a human gesture rather than an elder's recitation. The light collapsed inward and then shot up in a column that struck into the bosom of the night like a lance. For a moment, the charge made the air around them sing. The cost of Brent's binding became clear within seconds. A sound, faint but distinct, came from inside the jewel. A voice that was Brent's, and also not Brent's, like an echo in a room where time had pooled. He inhaled sharply and then was still. His chest moved less. T put her ear to his mouth and then drew back with tears leaking for reasons that were not joy. "It is not death," Hala said in a voice that trembled. "It is not merely sleep. A piece of him goes—" "Enough," Mortos said, not unkindly. He stepped back and spread his hands as if to show the kind of patience he thought the world lacked. "You think this ends the matter. You have made a lock, yes, but locks rust and hinges break. Your ring will sit safer while I learn its seams." They had not lain claim to any absolute victory. Mortos's retreat was a tactical withdrawal. In the days that followed, the North would celebrate a victory that was thrifted with loss. Brent was alive and yet absent in a way that hurt those who loved him. His eyes sometimes caught with a distance, and he started to dream in phrases that belonged to palace rooms he had not seen in years. People spoke of him in the same breath as they spoke of the ring. Sometimes they added a prayer. Clara watched the consequences like a woman tracing thin lines on a map. The ring sat in a shrine under guard, enclosed in wood and iron and the elders' sworn oaths. Mortos' forces withdrew into the wood, not gone but patient. The returned still walked at the periphery of borders, moved like a menace that could return at any season. Ulric's fate in the days after the ritual weighed on them. The wound Marissa had made had been mortal at worst, and curable at best. Yet when Mortos' servants came to test the ring's metal, they took him and bent him to their will. At some point, after a skirmish in which a patrol chasing reanimated men came upon Ulric in their midst, he rose and spoke in a voice that was both his and not. Marissa could have struck him down when he was weak and been absolved in the eyes of those who had suffered. Instead, she faced him and then turned her blade away, refusing the satisfaction. Ulric died later in a place where the trees leaned in, as if listening. No great moment crowned his end. It was small and flat, like the closing of a door. The North buried him with a spear laid across his chest, the symbol of a man who had been both shield and failing, and they said little about him. Some cursed his memory, others nodded as if acknowledging a lesson in fidelity and corruption both. Mortos, as the weeks grew thinner, did not vanish. He moved like a shadow, teaching villages that had been hollowed how to put their grief into commands, how to structure missing people into ranks. He did not promise resurrection as mercy, but as ledger. "This is how payment is made," he said, and the people who were tired listened as if to a sermon that might save their land from rust. But his ambition had been blunted in a way the elders had hoped. Brent's binding had not rendered the ring inert. The ring still glowed in particular circumstances. It still suggested things in dreams of blood. Yet by tethering it to a royal name and pouring an elder's chant around it, they had turned its hunger into a rule that made it less freely exploitable. Mortos's approach would be longer now, perhaps more cunning. For Clara, the aftermath was a map of new scars. Brent lay in the shrine sometimes, his face calm and far away, as if living inside marble. People came to touch the ring's casing and leave tokens, small things like coins and scraps of cloth. The North told itself the story of the prince who placed himself inside a jewel, and the tale grew with each telling into something like legend. But Clara knew the truth. Brent had not so much been given a story as he had been bound into an object that would remind future men of the cost of wanting to remold the dead. Clara tried to move on. She took the ring's watch like someone taking care of a fragile thing and yet not owning it. Leadership taught her small cruelties, deciding who would train, which outposts to defend, which children might be taken into the safest folds. She learned to say no to more things than she ever imagined. She found space for short tendernesses, a loaf given to a child, a patch sewn to a coat. Those things kept her human. But sometimes, in the deep of night, she would put her hand against the shrine and feel the faint sensation of someone else's breath rubbing against the glass. Mortos's threat did not end. He sent emissaries who pretended to visit in peace and then slunk away with information about guard rotations. He raised the dead in places where hunger made people desperate, then offered them an order in which they could belong. The necromancer's ideology spread not merely by force, but by convincing the broken that being returned as an obedient thing might be preferable to being left to rot. The North lived with his shadow like a persistent winter fog. Yet there were consequences to their ritual beyond the immediate military advantage. Brent's sacrifice turned the ring into a part relic and part prison. People came to it in reverence and in fear. Songs were sung in the long months after, in which the name of the ritual, the forbidden ritual of the northern warriors, was both curse and hymn. Mothers would tell children to be brave like the ones who had been bound. Warriors would drink to the fallen and then swear that their station would never again let power swallow souls. Legend had begun to gather on the ring like patina. Clara felt the weight of the legend pressing down. She had not wanted a crown. She had wanted a way to stop the thing that took her family from her. The ring had not given her that. It had given a political stopgap and a hole where a name now lived in glass. She found herself sometimes at the periphery of the shrine, thinking of the man Brent had been, his jokes about palace manners, the moment he had stood to defend a child from an arrow, the way he had laughed at a bad pun when they were trying to sleep in a foxhole. The ring had his name now, in a way that made him both a thing and a person. One night, months after the binding, Clara sat by a small fire and found Mortos's lieutenant walking into the light with a bundle wrapped in cloth. He offered it to her like a diplomacy, and inside was a bundle of letters, news taken from the fringes where Mortos still pulled strings. The letters told of small rebellions, of villages that had been told to hand over lists of the dead if they wanted protection. They told of men who had found a kind of peace in Mortos's order, and of others who had watched loved ones return empty and then curse the person who had agreed to it. The news made Clara think of the moral arithmetic that had led her to the north to steal a ring in the first place. "You did it right," the lieutenant said, a tone that suggested both praise and caution. "Binding will make the ring a thing to be guarded rather than used on impulse." Clara looked at him. "Did I do it right?" she asked. "We bought a fragile peace with a man's freedom. Is that the shape of rightness?" The lieutenant shrugged. "Sometimes right is a compromise with survival," he said. "History forgets the bargains and remembers the names." "You don't think Mortos will try to find a way?" Clara asked. "He will," the man said simply, "but not today. He learns like all politicians, by finding what the enemy cannot afford to lose. You made the ring costly to him." Clara put the letters back in the bundle and then pushed it away. The fire flared. She thought of the child who had never learned to walk in her memory of a village burned. She thought of the man in the ring whose breath had become a thing of glass. She thought of the rituals and the drums and the way the North had come together in something both terrible and needed. Power, she knew now, always had a tax collector. Years would tell the story differently. Ballads would speak of the hero who gave himself to a jewel to save a land. Others would mutter of a prince who was turned into an object, and of the city that could have been remade without blood. The prophecy would remain, stubborn as bone. The ring would not leave the royal line as long as a descendant lived. Brent's binding ensured the ring's legal attachment to that line, though it left open how future claimants might be used or saved. Mortos remained a threat, patient and cunning, his philosophy dispersed by practice. The North was stronger by the unifying terror of the ritual, and yet it carried the stain of what it had asked. Clara walked away from the shrine after the last of the rituals had been properly archived. She left the ring in its guarded case. She left Brent's name to the elders, and to the songs, and to the children who would ask about the man who slept inside glass. She walked north toward the places where broken things could be mended. Villages that needed rebuilding, children who needed teachers who would not trade them for legends. On the path, she met Mortos once more, but not in the fury of a battlefield. He stood under a pine, a distance apart, as if they had agreed unwritten rules of engagement. Enemies who would not kill each other outright because the world still had uses for such things. "You chose a noble theft," Mortos said, and there was no mockery in it. Only the tired cadence of a man who had learned that argument and force were different kinds of rhetoric. "You would rather make a martyr of your prince than make the dead your army." Clara stopped and looked at him. The ring did not glint because it was not with her, but she could feel its heat in her memory. "You argue order," she said. "I argue the price." "You believe you have changed the trajectory," Mortos said quietly, "but all you have done is moved an equation. The ring is quieter now, yes, useful for you. But what if a child of Brent's were to live and die? The prophecy still hangs in the balance. The ring will remember lineage as well as names. Someone will always desire what you have gated." Clara met his gaze. For a man who promised the dead a new order, Mortos had a certain weary honesty. "Perhaps she said. "But we made a choice. We wrote into the world one act of consent. That matters." Mortos smiled as if that mattered to him and then turned away. "History prefers that we act," he said. "I will act as well. What you do with your choices is the small thing I have to navigate." They left one another, and the road bent with the